Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Kavat. World leaders have just concluded their Asia-Pacific Economic Forum, or APEC, and G20 summits in South America, a region where China has replaced the US as a dominant trade partner. In the APEC family photo, outgoing Joe Biden stood one from the end of the back row. In contrast, Xi Jinping was positioned front and center next to host Peruvian President Dina Boluarte. And with the opening of Peru's China-funded Chancay port, symbolizing Beijing's rising influence within the global south, what does this mean for global politics as Washington transitions to a second Trump administration? Joining us today are Liu Fu-kuo, National Chengchi University Institute of International Relations Research Fellow, and Brian Hioe, New Bloom magazine founding editor. Very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. As he arrived in Brazil, Xi Jinping said he was looking forward to meeting with President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva and celebrating 50 years of diplomatic ties and also ushering in another 50 golden years. The Chinese leader said China and Brazil are like-minded friends with the same aspirations and good partners forging ahead hand in hand. Although separated by oceans, China and Brazil, two major developing countries in the eastern and western hemispheres, respectively, are attracted to each other and echo each other at a distance. So, Professor Liu, let me come to you first. What do you make of the parallel that Xi is making here and also the relationship between Brazil and China?
Last month, when BRICS summit was held in Kazan, and during that particular summit, Xi Jinping was trying to convince Brazil to come to admit or endorse Belt and Road Initiative, but at that time, Brazil expressed such a conservation. The country did not really put forward with this Belt and Road Initiative idea. And after that, the media, in general terms, suggested that this is a failure for China. Many experts in Brazil show that immediately endorse a Belt and Road Initiative, Brazil may not immediately get this benefit from Belt and Road Initiative. This is number one. Number two, as you just opening up by suggesting, the second term of Donald Trump is on the way. So Brazil would like to take more neutral position. In a way, if Brazil should endorse Chinese Belt and Road Initiative just around this transitional period of time, it may become more difficult when Donald Trump arrives, and how Brazil will open up the new page with Donald Trump's administration. So putting all together, this is what we learn at this moment.
So Brian, Brazil may be hedging a little bit there. What, though, would you say that their relationship, their growing relationship, and very strong? I mean, 15 years of China being Brazil's largest trading partner, $100 billion in Chinese imports for the past 3 years. What does their relationship symbolize globally?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it is particularly an issue. Brazil is a major economy, as also part of being BRICS, along with China. It is one of the major growing economies of the world. And in this sense, there's a lot of economic heft as well as political heft. And I think that particularly Lula, for example, as president, has positioned himself as very left-wing, which is also what China frames itself as. And so there are grounds then for perhaps building alliance ties in kind of resistance to, let's say, the hegemony of the West. They would perhaps use such framing. And it is interesting, though, regarding that there has been this move, and that for now Lula has declined with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. Part of it is hedging bets, but it could also be a negotiating tactic, because if you too quickly agree to it, then perhaps you don't get as much from China in that sense.
Right. Okay. Very interesting. Now, Xi Jinping announced he would support global development with 8 actions, including the signature Belt and Road Initiative. He also announced that Brazil and South Africa had joined China in forming the Open Science International Cooperation Initiative, designed to funnel innovations in technology to the global south. Xi said China has always been a member of the global south, a reliable and long-term partner of developing countries, and an activist and doer in support of global development. Professor, what do you make of those comments? Has China always been a member of the Global South?
Yes. China, beginning of 1949, has already positioned itself being part of a developing country, the third world, as well as global south. But more importantly, as we can see, this is a critical moment. Donald Trump 2.0 is coming in. So while Donald Trump is presenting more deglobalization efforts, while throughout the last week or so, Xi Jinping attended APEC summit and then G20 summit, suggesting everyone should really work together, pushing for further globalization. So as you mentioned, he has put up 8 actions, which mainly including Belt and Road Initiative, as well as supporting Global South to get rid of poverty and also trying to push for the next step of development, economic development.
If we consider the Belt and Road Initiative, this is billions of dollars of infrastructure that China is building. So can we class China as part of this developing global south if it has so much money, so much financial clout, economic influence all around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a question. Particularly, China did come from a place of poverty, but now it is quite affluent and is expanding its reach overseas, and often trying to mimic the institutions by which the US secured its global power. And so that has been the accusation then leveled against the Belt and Road Initiative. For example, in Africa, one has seen accusations of neo-colonialism. And so that is also the question here. Particularly, China likes to appeal to this past history of, for example, South-South solidarity or the non-alignment movement. And particularly, I think with Donald Trump set to come into office, he's likely to take a very aggressive tone, and that creates more opportunities for China to play up this narrative. And so I think it is likely to do so.
Right. And Professor, though we should say that sort of debt diplomacy that China has often been accused of, and particularly in Africa, as Brian mentioned, and that's not so much the case, is it, in this region, is Latin America?
So far, there is no clear example yet, but after all the studies, this claim of debt trap is very much from Western society, especially American and Europeans, criticizing China for doing such things. But if we look into another dimension, many developing countries actually welcome such a economic development project from China, supporting them to improve their infrastructure initiative. So this is, from my perspective, this is very much a global strategic competition between the US and China. So China is now moving into a different way. As I described briefly, President Donald Trump is on the way back, and he is encouraging America first. Forget about the rest of the world. It seems there is a dimension he is going to further isolate the United States from many other countries.
Okay, I want to give Brian a chance to respond just on what Professor's comment, saying that it was the Western narrative of debt trap being associated with China. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think particularly there's a lot of focus on development, particularly in South America, for example. But then often the projects that China finances are pushing out local communities, for example, indigenous communities. And that has been the case with a lot of China's actions, I think, globally. And honestly, that does remind quite of the US back in the day. And so I think there is that pushback at local communities, and particularly for political leaders such as Lula that want to position themselves as receptive to grassroots communities. I think that might be actually a bit of a stumbling block in terms of embracing, for example, China immediately.
Okay, now Joe Biden and Xi Jinping summit in Lima, Peru. On the sidelines of APEC was their third in-person meeting as leaders, and their first since the San Francisco APEC forum last year, where they agreed to put a floor under strained ties. Now, the two men met for 2 hours, during which Xi mentioned Taiwan's president, Lai Ching-te, by name. Xi called on the US to again unequivocally oppose Taiwan independence and support so-called China's peaceful reunification. However, in the US readout, President Biden said this. He reiterated that the United States opposes any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side, and that we expect, he said, cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means, and that the world has an interest in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Biden also called for an end to destabilizing PRC military activity around Taiwan. That was according to the White House statement. Professor, what do the difference in these two readouts suggest to you?
Lately, we have seen last summit between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in San Francisco, and also this year when both of them met, there is a report suggesting that President Xi Jinping is trying to convince American counterpart to utilize this particular wording opposed to independence of Taiwan. But the US government has been very careful in utilizing the words describing the policy. So this has been something, at least from my interpretation, two significant meaning. One is United States for now, before passing on to the next administration, Joe Biden will maintain whatever it has existed for decades. He does not want to move on to such a wording suggested by Chinese side. The second point is there is a significant security concern in the Taiwan Strait. So Joe Biden in this meeting re-emphasized Chinese sides would have to be very cautious about expanding military postures in the Taiwan Strait.
So, Brian, I'd like to get your thoughts as well, maybe on the meeting between the two sides and in terms of the Taiwan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's quite often that the readout between the US and China differs in terms of their, let's say, respective interpretations of the same meeting. And it is a way of the two sides contending each other subtly without necessarily having an open disagreement. But then it is clear that China would like to see stronger wording from the US on the issue of Taiwan, which will not happen. But it is interesting, as was remarked upon, that Biden is maintaining the present line of the US because there are many uncertainties of what happens when the Trump administration takes power, but that's not something Biden wants to occur. And there have been occasions on which Biden seemed to indicate a change in position through various comments, but then this was walked back, and in the printout, it always was the original position. And so I think that will maintain.
Right. And Professor, moving to focus on Taiwan, in some reports, Beijing has offered to guarantee the safety of Taiwan representatives in APEC in China. And also Lin Shi, the Taiwanese representative at APEC this year, didn't get to greet or shake hands with Xi Jinping, although he did with Joe Biden. But there was a wave between himself and Xi Jinping. So how do you assess, is it positive or?
This is very difficult to say because the body language will show some implication. But this time, I don't know exactly what happened between President Xi Jinping and former Minister Lin Xinyi. He represented, but I can imagine in this difficult situation between Beijing and Taipei, normally Xi Jinping would not want to have a public greeting to special envoy from Taiwan. I remember before last year, President Tsai Ing-wen requested James Song to be her special envoy to APEC. But during the year, President Xi Jinping did not really shake hands with him in a way to reflect ongoing unsatisfaction of dissatisfaction with the current situation in the Taiwan Strait. But I think the most important thing is when China takes up chair of APEC in 2026, the important thing is every one of the members of APEC would really like to assure China will follow through this international practice, welcome Taiwan's delegation. So without any security concern, which has been admitted during the meeting, President Xi Jinping already promised until then he would just follow international example and also practice to receive all delegates from different countries. But it is hard to say diplomatically, but I should say it reflects some unease situation between Taipei and Beijing now.
Okay, so do you agree with that assessment, Brian? Does it reflect unease, or were you actually surprised?
I think it's a question, and I think it does also raise a question of who would be sent for such a meeting, because in the past it has been, for example, James Song or Morris Chang, in an attempt to signal, for example, friendly ties. James Song because he is part of the Pan Blue camp, and Morris Chang because of TSMC's eminent position in terms of the world. And so I think it raises the stakes actually for the next meeting, because I mean, we are here talking about, for example, the implication for BRICS because it was in Brazil. And what would happen then, for example, if it is in China? It raises further questions regarding China and Taiwan, but also China's global power in the world.
Right, yes, China's rising influence. Now, in his summit with Biden, Xi Jinping's so-called 4 red lines was, of course, topped by Taiwan, but then followed by democracy and human rights, path and institutions, and right to development. So, Professor, what message do you think Xi Jinping intended to give to Washington with these 4 red lines?
My assessment is really ahead of Donald Trump's administration. He wants to lay down this red line, #1 Taiwan issue. The rest of them are democracy and human rights and paths and institution and all that. Basically, he wants to confirm such a guideline for China to work with United States government and also carry such a message to the rest of the world. China will, based on this concern, working with the United States government.
But Professor, could I ask you, so when he raises as the second red line, democracy and human rights, what does that mean?
This is more on Chinese definition of human right and also democracy, which from my understanding is he was trying to define this by its own meaning. It means that the United States and Western countries should not interfere in the Chinese style of human rights and also democracy. Because from outside, we consider different level of democracy and also protecting human rights. But just look into latest development in Hong Kong. Chinese will go through their due process through those, what they call the crime in this social disorder. But many other Western countries now criticizing Chinese government. So my assessment is this is also sending strong message. The US would have to respect something different in between the US and China.
Brian, your thoughts on that, the message to the new Trump administration?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly there's a question if the Trump administration will take up the critique that the US has historically had of China on human rights grounds. For example, the trial of the Hong Kong 47 was just brought up, and the sentencing occurred just a few days ago. And Trump has claimed, for example, he can get Jimmy Lai, the Apple Daily publisher, out of jail. But will he follow up on that? That's a question. But I think it is more or less the same message that we hear from China historically, emphasizing core interests and that the US should not intervene. And that includes in terms of its development and in terms of its own definition of human rights in democracy, in which you don't have elections and you have the same leader serving continuously in office, but also then Taiwan. And I think then that this is perhaps the ways in which China hopes to conduct relations with the US going forward, but also it reflects that there will be these barriers, I think, in which there cannot be an agreed upon position. And so there is likely to be tension if the US maintains its current position in the new administration.
The $1.3 billion Chancay port is a deep water port in Peru, capable of receiving megaships and majority owned by China Ocean Shipping Group, or COSCO. Now, the current shipping routes between Peru and China are about 35 days, and they take too long for most perishable foods to reach markets. The port is expected to cut the journey time by 30% and reorder regional trade routes away from the US. Now, meanwhile, for Brazil, the Wall Street Journal reports those journey times could be as much as halved. South America has abundant natural resources, including critical minerals, human capital to deploy for manufacturing products such as pharmaceuticals. They have growing consumer bases and rule of law. However, over the past 20 years, China's trade with the region has overtaken that of the US. Professor, let me ask you, so is the port symbolic of what some have been saying is China's marginalization of the US in Latin America?
I guess at this moment, this kind of statement may be overestimated, but I can sense the United States has not really paid sufficient attention to what it should have in the region, its own backyard. So just look back in the last decade or so, the United States did not really share good relations with many South Latin American countries.
Why do you think they
politically, because it used to be the time that left-wing government mostly ruled different countries, but gradually accumulated, especially a number of issues like illegal immigration, immigrants moving, passing through different countries, crossing the border. But of course, China has made a very systematic effort almost right before Xi Jinping took the office. So they have already penetrated into Latin America. And currently, with this megaport planning to be developed, China is linked with Maritime Silk Road, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which I consider, if this is completed, China can directly get access to Latin America, not just Peru itself, but neighboring country. All the important resources will be able to shift much quicker back to China. So this is a way, as I can see, a successful advance of Belt and Road Initiative in this part of the world.
Right. And Brian, we'll move on to talking about the fears of the US. Obviously, they have concerns about this port and China's rising influence, essentially having access to the resources of the region. However, before that, I do need to say that the US investment into the region is still higher than China's, though China has overtaken in terms of trade. Let's go on to some of the other fears. A leading motivation for Beijing's attention on Latin America and the Caribbean is isolating Taiwan. 7 of Taiwan's 11 diplomatic allies are in the region, including Guatemala, Paraguay, and Haiti. 5 that switched recognition to Beijing under Xi's watch, including Honduras and Panama, were showered with Chinese deals. Rhodium Group and the Atlantic Council say that in a Taiwan crisis, Beijing could be expected to offer inducements toward nations like Brazil to reject the kind of decoupling pressure Russia faced after it invaded Ukraine. So, Brian, how substantial do you think are Washington's concerns that China could get this military foothold, in this neighborhood, which is the US's neighborhood, and that it could then, harness this in any possible Taiwan crisis?
Yeah, I think it's likely to come up in regards to the Taiwan contingency possibilities, because it is rather distant, but I think there is concern from the U.S. about Chinese expansion overseas. For example, the first overseas military base was in Africa for China, and the U.S. does operate a network of bases worldwide, but particularly, again, Latin America, it has seen that as its own backyard, and so this would be seen as threatening. There's always concern regarding civilian-military integration, and with regards to megaport projects, or cases in which China takes up a port, as for example in Greece, that has been object for concern, because I think there is these security concerns that then come up. But what's interesting is that particularly the Trump administration is quite hostile towards Latin American countries in rhetoric. And so trying to curb Chinese influence through engagement, that would require a sort of U-turn. And so I think that is a question, actually, what would occur? And so those are opportunities I think that China would take up, using this kind of lack of engagement from the US as a momentum there.
Mm. Professor, I'd like to get your thoughts. Obviously, you're a security expert, on the importance of the region for a possible Taiwan crisis. I mean, what advantages would it bring China to have that port, which is a deep water port? It can accept mega ships, as we said, becoming a military base for China.
Right. I basically think when China can utilize this mega port in South America, and it would really facilitate such a political, military influence and also economic influence into wider region. Obviously, our diplomatic allies are currently under such influence, so it would extraordinarily aid this diplomatic crisis to Taiwan. I can imagine, because when global economy is going downward, many countries trying to develop their economy, so they want to attach to a large market, which China has. So in this sense, when China can open up this megapole, obviously back and forth communication would increase the influence penetrating into the region, and also carry through this Belt and Road Initiative. As you just mentioned, the large number of these investment will be coming from China into the region. So this will be a great challenge for Taiwan from now if this megapole formally develop and start operating.
Right. And then, Brian, if I could give you the final words. So you mentioned about the Trump administration and how, there are doubts over whether it could shift any of the trend lines that have been occurring in terms of China's influence in this region, and moving away from just anti-immigration policy directed to this region. What is your hunch on whether it would try to do anything like that over the next 4 years, the Trump administration?
I think it's a really good question. I think particularly if it becomes framed as something that harms America's interests or prestige, then Trump may be more attentive to the issue. But at present, we have many questions about who the appointments in his administration would be, and this is clearly not one of his arenas of focus. I think there is perhaps focus on China, and there's a lot of discussion of the hawks he has appointed, for example, to his administration. But Latin America and South America are not seen as points of contention currently. I think we'll have to really see if the discourse in the US changes. But there has been calls from groups such as Atlantic Council and so forth that there should be more attention paid there.
Right, because it's a large part of the global south. We're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Liu Fu-kuo and Brian Hioe, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.